hegemony, of course, in Gramsci's theory, is taken up by the subject. That is the only place it lives. There's not a building, there's not a generator in a room with mysterious plugs. It exists in us. So, with that in mind, commenting on this afternoon's papers, very interesting for me, Floyd and Behali both write about Iraqi modernists, if I've understood correctly. Faik Hassan in Floyd's case, Joel Salim and Behali's. The monographic form for both of them provides a really powerful tool for undercutting facile morphologies. And here we can just go to some of these Google images, right? Just putting in the artist's name, terrible resolution. I managed to find the same painting she was talking about. Got a different title, but this is the work that's circulating under this author name. The monographic form provides this tool for them in order to undercut facile morphologies, they hope. By delving into these individuals' precise biographies, they can undercut the power of the image which circulates free of that information. Through the individual, we can enter the realm of artistic intention, where Hassan, for example, seeks a new essence of Iraq to place in painting, and Salim produces texts and manifesti with which to create a local art world. I was struck by Floyd's privileging of Hassan's, quote, stylistic innovation, unquote, right? This is her word, or the word in the version of the paper I was sent. And similarly, Salim talks about Salim's style, right? Style is a very vexed and, of course, central category in art history. The very terms of this phrase should give us pause, since they suggest the adoption of an existing style in order to innovate within it or propel from it toward another trajectory. Salim is lucky because his artist is very self-conscious of this, is articulate about it, is writing a manifesto about it. But these linguistic analogies are very profound. There's no way to inhabit style, which comes etymologically from the word stylus, with which one writes, without some shared formal language, from within which stylishness can be detected. Okay, so we're already in fraught territory. We already have to share some kind of language, albeit a visual one, in order to detect difference or uniqueness, right? I think rather than attempting a salvage operation based on Hassan's innovativeness, Floyd would be best to question the very terms by which modernism has privileged innovation itself, looking to emphasize instead her argument that by embedding the mark of the cuneiform, if we accept that PowerPoint art history, which we may question, but if we accept that by embedding the mark of the cuneiform in his syncretic representations, which to my eye meld Cubism and German Expressionism, as did many in the interwar and post-war periods, he enters an international conversation in order to speak a new subject for Iraq, right? He has to be in that, he wants to be in that conversation. He doesn't want to be in the conversation with his neighbor next door. He wants to be in that larger conversation in order to insist on the subject, the new subject for Iraq. This allows me to address the general fecundity of the conference framing, and this session in specific, but I'd kind of like to tweak the title. So by substituting repetition for similarity, we get closer to one of my favorite philosophers, Gilles Deleuze, who's taught us in Repetition and Difference, which was incredibly his doctoral dissertation, why the adoption of a banal seriality, a repetition, is the very ground from which difference can be achieved. Context is also important here. In Deleuze's classic example, classic for me, I mean, this is how I remember his argument, the rioting crowds who broke into a particular prison during the French Revolution don't know about Bastille Day, right? That happens only in repetition. As language, as performance, as ritual, as enforced state holiday, however you want to think about it, it happens only in repetition. And difference can be wrought from that French national holiday only once its seriality has been secured. Thus, the context of transfer, and I don't have these slides tied to anything in particular, just randomly move on to the next one. The context of transfer and relocation is important for each and every one of these artists and for their speakers today, who bring their knowledge of Cubism from some source in France. And this is true for Shaw's Turkish D group as well. The French teaching is brought feverishly back to tumultuous urban settings, whether those are in Baghdad or Istanbul, feverishly evolving there. It's feverish because everything is changing. Evolves like any culture put into a growth medium. I mean, in other words, these are places of dynamic change. If they brought it back to North Carolina, where I was growing up at these years, you know, it would have happened, okay? So, I can assure you that once out of Paris, Cubo-expressionism, as I want to call it, will be different because its audience must be created and cannot be assumed, right? So that growth medium is not available in Paris, right? It's only available in these situations. And that's where these styles can live and can become living art. And thus, difference proliferates out of repetition, right? Cubo-expressionism in Baghdad is almost certainly not Cubo-expressionism in Durham, North Carolina, where I grew up seeing similar paintings than these. Hassan's paintings in particular look very much like those of 1950s artists who taught at Duke during my childhood. I have one of these somewhere. So, you know, okay, this is like a tiny thumb peg, you know, JPEG blown up, but I mean, this is 1950s Cubo-expressionism in Durham, North Carolina, right? Equally provincial, but with none of the cultural ferment, none of the responsibility for making a new citizen, just repetition, you know? And mind you, we can equally draw up examples from Brazil, you know, Candido Pontinati, you know, the favored wall decorator of Oscar Niemeyer, right? Right? Or what else was I thinking of? I mean, in other words, these are global lingua francas. It's what they're speaking of in the local, which is of course significant in what art history can do, which is what we've seen. So maybe we'll sit with this one for a while. Although this one is really amazing. Okay, just think about that. Think about that African sculpture sitting there. What's that for? So Bololi's monograph on Jawal Salim is helpful in specifying the terms of this transfer and relocation and on what forms of permission were required for it to be accomplished. So Salim finds two forms of permission. One from Paris, encouraging him to discover the 13th century miniatures of Al-Wasiti. And again, you know, punch that name in. I found the camels too. That was really exciting to me. And another form of permission from these Polish soldiers, educated in a still different Paris tradition, Bonnat rather than Braque. So we've heard about three different kinds of Cubism today, right? Maybe Bonnat isn't even Cubist, but he has to somehow deal with, you know, that radiation, even in his reception, right? So that also should give us pause, right? Now, the Cubism itself, modernism itself is not monolithic, and the reason why I got excited by that African sculpture is that the Cubism of Demoiselle is extremely different from Apollinaire's version, or Kahnweiler's version, or Metzinger's version, or Glaise's version, right? The Cubism of Demoiselle is by a swarthy Moorish-feeling guy walking around Paris, not speaking French, and being just furious at the French tradition that he has to somehow find his way into, right? So I'm picturing Tolu kind of listening to the African sculpture here, you know. So let's see where I am. The Polish soldiers. These fellow foreigners to the School of Paris give Salim permission to question doctrinaire Cubism, and they do so together in a fictively French cafe named Brasilia in the belly of Baghdad. Right? So the will to globality here, the yearning for cosmopolitanism, which has to be built on the ground. Right? Cosmopolitanism doesn't live in that airplane that Tallien showed us. It lives once those people get off the steps and start having dinner parties. Right? I love the motleyiness of all this. It's necessary miscegenating zeal. And I would caution both Floyd and Bololi against too eagerly differentiating their fabulous syncretizers, right, and forcing them to work in search of local essences. I think you have to celebrate their reach, their encompassing grasp. I think that's part of the history of that moment that they exemplified so beautifully. What links Shaw's narratives of 1930s Istanbul to Floyd's and Bolody's tales of 50s Baghdad are these decades of mixing and syncretism, miscegenation, and mangled essentialisms, I mean willfully mangled essentialisms, by distinguishing kinds of Cubisms, which your paper did so beautifully, which by the 30s included the Bergsonian Puto group as well as the first-order Platonism of Kahnweiler and Apollinaire. She underscores the importance we see in all these narratives of breaking the grand récit, right? Whether it's the Puto group breaking the grand récit of Apollinaire and Kahnweiler, or the D group. For the D group, who would picture themselves in self-portraits with an African sculpture in the background, it was crucial to see the Africanisms, the Moorishness of Picasso, right? I mean, that's why he was the name to conjure with in some sense. Picasso, who was himself, after all, just another foreigner who'd come to Paris to break with the academic traditions that he was forced to imbibe in his colonial situation over there in Spain. Bolody captures this as well, the sign of the author named Picasso as the one who'd done it, the swarthy guy who fantasized his own otherness into art and mangled the language of French, but took over the whole game, right? I mean, this is Muhammad Ali of the art world of that time. Shaw's narrative presents a rich institutional account, and here, you know, just another random image I found. I have no idea the date of this, or the kind of made-up frame. I think this must be, you know, an eBay poster or something that somebody's trying to sell you of this painting. You know, which again brings up a very rich topic of reception that we touched on, but we haven't really dug into. Who's buying the poster and the made-up computer frame? So Shaw's narrative permits this very richest institutional account of critics and intellectuals working out the terms of a social art, rescuing this very important original aspect of avant-garde theory. Her paper makes a vital point that we can then read back into the other papers that we heard. What is missing in Turkey and Iraq, or what is fragile, right, is this secular cosmopolitan, right? Until these secular revolutions happen, and I'm a little vague on when, you know, Saddam Hussein creates the secular Stalinist state, you know, but I mean that should come into the conversation. These are movements that are very important for our understandings, and someone like me is just going to be stupid about them until they're brought into the art history and reminding me of what the temporality is there. So the point is that these fragile groups are attempting to make a public art world, unaffiliated with the academy, a place of exhibition that builds the very concept of art as that which might be detached from either utility, dailiness, or decor, because many of the academies and the state apparatuses were about decorating public buildings and public spaces, right? So this is an important concept, and sort of offline, off mic, I was talking to Taline about the Iranian world in which she said the free universities had created a new space for generating art. And I said, what did you mean, free, like that you can go for free? And she said, no, free from the state. In other words, private universities where you pay to go, but you can paint what you want. And that was an interesting moment, I guess, that happened in the 90s. Anyway, this power of public exhibition, which Bolody too speaks of, is, in the case of these important miniatures by Al-Wasadi, they come into the present when they are shown and when they are published, right? In 1938, accompanied by their gorgeously illustrated glossy magazines. When Baghdad would pioneer the first pan-Arab biennial in the mid-50s, it would enter the world under the name of Al-Wasati, who now, you know, is substituted for Picasso. So these are very important moves of publicness, moves of Öffentlichkeit to keep in mind. The history and influence of exhibitionary forms dissociated from the Academy are only beginning to be examined. And I want to conclude by recalling another crucial exhibition, the 1910 exhibition in Munich. This is, again, a Google, substitute for any real art history that I don't have the capacity to do here, but the 1910 exhibition in Munich, which attempted to de-orientalize the view of the Middle East for modernity, right? to bring the Middle East into modernity as a source of abstraction. I mean, there's more of a history than just looking at the 50s paintings and saying breaking with realism is rediscovering abstract. I mean, these things have histories. How does modernism reclaim the others' modes of abstraction, right? These things have real histories. These things have vectors that we need to remember and record and examine and so on. So, the Meisterwerk, Mohammedanische Kunst, bequeaths to us the category of Islamic art. One which, of course, brings us together here, but which we should inhabit uneasily. We should have sand in that skin. To go back to, I guess, Arindam's metaphor, right? We should be scratching that skin. We know the impact these 3,600 objects had on Henri Matisse, whose art was profoundly altered by the experience. And I'm morally certain that the buzz would have reached Picasso, whose demoiselles were already built on a fantasy of Moorish manhood, by which he wasn't sure he was the prostitute in the harem or the guy who was the patron. I mean, he really slid both ways. And I was struck by the little image of the post-demoiselle head that was illustrating Salim's brother's 1970s book, because it is precisely in those sketches where we see Picasso moving from his self-portrait into the demoiselle, from the demoiselle into his self-portrait. He is the black whore. I mean, he is the African in those paintings. From his own fantasy position, but he is, in Paris, the African. What Hassan, Salim, and Shaw's great intellectual Ismail Haqqi recognized in Cubism and modern art then was permission to see their own traditions as open and generative for the modern projects in which all of them were engaged. The American pragmatist John Dewey would see modern art in similar ways, but without this mirroring condition. In other words, Dewey's art and experience from those 1935 lectures would seem to have great resonance with that 1931 book that I learned about from Wendy Shaw, Haqi's 1931 Democracy in Art. Perhaps he even knew it. I mean, these are the untold intellectual histories of our age. But US culture had great difficulty connecting with the geometries undergirding the European modernism that the D group and their Baghdad companions found compellingly familiar. So that's the end of my comments, and I hope we can open up from here.